70,000 men dead in a single day. Not from a natural disaster, not from a plague, but from one battle alone. It's estimated that every minute 100 Roman soldiers fell, and this continued for hours on end. 20% of all Roman men of fighting age were wiped out in just one August afternoon. This was the bloodiest day in Roman history, a catastrophe that 2,000 years later historians still study in disbelief. And the man who caused all of this wasn't leading a massive army. He was just one man with 40,000 troops. A man who had devoted his entire life to a single goal, an oath he had kept since he was a 9-year-old boy. That oath was simple, just 6 words, but it would completely reshape the history of the Mediterranean for over a century. The oath was, "I will never be a friend of Rome," and that man's name was Hannibal. In 247 BC, in the city of Carthage in North Africa, a child was born into the most powerful family. Carthage at that time was the mightiest trading empire in the Mediterranean, wealthy from commerce, with the largest fleet in the ancient world. But they had just lost to Rome in the First Punic War, losing Sicily, losing their fleet, and forced to pay enormous reparations for decades. The child's father was Hannibal Barca, Carthage's greatest general, who had fought until the very end in the war they just lost. Barca in Phoenician means lightning, and this family was born not to be merchants, but to wield swords on the battlefield. When the child turned 9, his father took him to the sacred temple, where flames burned day and night in honor of Carthage's gods. Hamilcar made his son place his hand over the flame and swear an oath that would follow him for life, an oath he could never forget. That oath was just 6 words: "I will never be a friend of Rome." The 9-year-old boy swore it, and he kept his word until his dying breath. Afterward, Hamilcar took his son to Spain, where he was building a new empire for Carthage from the rich silver and gold mines. Hamilcar died in battle in 228 BC, when Hannibal was only 19, still too young to inherit his father's power. Hannibal's brother-in-law, Hasdrubal, took command of the army. But 8 years later, he too was assassinated by an old enemy seeking revenge. In 221 BC, Hannibal was 26 years old, and the Carthaginian army in Spain unanimously elected him as their commander. The child from years ago had grown into a man, and now he commanded the finest army Carthage had fielded since the First Punic War. 2 years later, in 219 BC, Hannibal attacked the city of Saguntum, a Roman ally on the coast of Spain. He knew exactly what this meant, that Rome would consider it an act of war, and that was precisely what he had wanted for 20 years. Rome declared war on Carthage, and they prepared to fight him in Spain or invade North Africa, as they had done successfully before. But Hannibal had a different plan, a plan no one thought possible, not even Rome's most brilliant minds. He would not wait for Rome to come to him. He would go to Rome himself, striking them on the very soil they had considered invincible for centuries. To do this, he would have to cross the Alps, the natural barrier that Romans believed no large army could ever pass through. And what happened over the next few months would make Hannibal a legend, even among the very enemies who wanted him dead. In April 218 BC, Hannibal departed from Cartagena, the Carthaginian capital in Spain, leading a massive army. 90,000 infantry, 12,000 cavalry, and 37 war elephants, the living tanks of the ancient world. His plan was to march from Spain, through what is now southern France, cross the Alps, and descend into northern Italy for a surprise attack. This was a journey of over 1,500 kilometers on foot through treacherous mountains, rivers, and countless hostile tribes. Hannibal crossed the Pyrenees between Spain and France. Local tribes attacked, and he lost soldiers from the very first leg of the journey. He advanced through Gaul, the land of fierce Celtic warriors, fighting and negotiating to clear a path for his massive army. At the Rhône River, one of Europe's largest, he faced a problem no one had anticipated: how to get the elephants across. Hannibal ordered large rafts to be built and covered with earth, so the elephants would think they were walking on solid ground, and he succeeded in crossing the entire herd. In September, Hannibal stood before the Alps, snow-capped peaks soaring white against the sky like a wall separating him from Rome. This was Europe's highest natural barrier, where snow falls year-round on the peaks, where chasms could swallow an entire army in an instant. The Romans believed no one could bring a large army across the Alps, especially in late autumn when snow was already falling heavily on the passes. Hannibal thought otherwise, and he began to climb, leading 90,000 men and 37 elephants into mountains many would never leave. From the very first days, mountain tribes attacked from above, rolling boulders down, firing arrows, then vanishing into the fog before the Carthaginians could respond. Soldiers died from the cold, died from starvation when supplies ran out, died from slipping off icy paths and falling hundreds of meters with no one able to save them. The elephants, massive creatures from the warm lands of North Africa, couldn't withstand the bone-cutting cold, and they began collapsing one by one along the way. One section of the path was blocked by a massive boulder with no way around, and Hannibal's huge army was trapped in the endless snow-covered mountains. According to the historian Livy, Hannibal ordered fires lit to heat the boulder, then poured vinegar on it, causing the rock to crack and crumble, clearing the way for the army to continue toward Italy. 16 days crossing the Alps. 16 days in a frozen hell. And when Hannibal descended into Italy's Po Valley, he counted his surviving troops. From 90,000 infantry, roughly 20 to 25,000 remained. From 12,000 cavalry, 6,000, and only a handful of elephants survived. He had lost nearly half his army just from the journey without fighting a single battle against Rome, but he had done what the world thought impossible. When news reached Rome that Hannibal had appeared in northern Italy, the Romans couldn't believe it. They thought it was a rumor no one could cross the Alps with a large army. But it was no rumor. Hannibal was in their homeland, and the Gallic tribes of northern Italy, hearing the news, flocked to join his army. Hannibal's forces quickly swelled again 60,000, then 70,000, all warriors who hated Rome and wanted revenge. Now Hannibal had troops, the element of surprise, and most importantly, he stood on Italian soil, where no enemy of Rome had ever set foot. Rome hastily dispatched armies northward to crush the invader, believing the exhausted force that had crossed the Alps couldn't possibly resist. They didn't know they were facing one of the greatest military geniuses in human history, a man who would teach them lessons paid for in blood. Over the next 3 years, Hannibal would kill 150,000 Roman soldiers, 1/5 of all their men of fighting age. How could a smaller army, thousands of kilometers from home, repeatedly defeat the most powerful empire in the Mediterranean? The answer lies in 3 battles, 3 military masterpieces still taught in military academies around the world 2,000 years later. In November 218 BC, at the Tichinus River in northern Italy, Roman forces under General Scipio the Elder first clashed with Hannibal's cavalry. It was just a skirmish, but the Carthaginian cavalry crushed the Roman horsemen, and Scipio himself was seriously wounded, nearly killed if not for his son's rescue. That son was only 17 years old, also named Scipio, and he would reappear later with a far greater role in our story. In December, at the Trebia River, Roman forces under General Sempronius assembled 40,000 men, determined to crush Hannibal once and for all. Hannibal also had about 40,000 troops. The numbers were equal, but he had something Rome didn't, a plan. He sent cavalry to provoke the Romans at dawn, luring them to cross the Trebia while it was still freezing cold, and the soldiers hadn't eaten breakfast. The river was chest deep and ice cold. The Roman soldiers were soaked, hungry, shivering, but they pressed on because Sempronius wanted a quick victory. What they didn't know was that Hannibal had hidden 2,000 of his best troops in a ravine behind them, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. When the Romans had advanced deep into the battlefield, the trap sprang. The hidden force attacked from behind, while Carthaginian cavalry swept in from both flanks. 20,000 Roman soldiers were killed or captured that day. Only 10,000 under Sempronius managed to hold formation and escape to Placentia. This was the first major battle, and Rome was stunned. but they still believed it was just a setback, that their army remained superior in every way. 6 months later, in June 217 BC, Hannibal moved south, and Roman general Flaminius led 25,000 troops in pursuit. Flaminius was a Roman consul, an impatient politician eager for glory, wanting a quick victory to boost his career. Hannibal knew this. He deliberately left a trail, luring Flaminius to follow, and he chose the perfect site for an ambush, Lake Trasimene. Lake Trasimene was the largest lake in the Italian peninsula, surrounded by forested hills, with a narrow road running between the lakeshore and steep mountainsides. Hannibal hid his entire 50,000 troops in the forests on the hills, concealed in the thick morning fog of an early summer day by the lake. According to military historian Liddell Hart, this was the largest full army ambush in history. No one had ever hidden an entire army to spring such a trap. On the morning of June 21st, the Roman army marched into the narrow road, Flaminius leading confidently at the front, believing Hannibal was fleeing ahead. The fog lifted, and 50,000 Carthaginian soldiers poured down from every direction from the hills, from the forests blocking both front and rear. The Romans had no time to form battle lines, no time to react. They were driven to the lakeshore and slaughtered like sheep in a pen, with no escape. In 2 to 3 hours, 15,000 Roman soldiers died, including Consul Flaminius, killed on the battlefield. Another 15,000 were taken prisoner. Only a few escaped, and when the news reached Rome, the city plunged into panic. Rome had lost 2 consuls in 2 consecutive battles, something that had never happened in their history since the city's founding centuries earlier. They appointed Fabius Maximus as dictator with supreme power, and he implemented a new strategy. Avoid direct confrontation, wear Hannibal down gradually. The Fabian strategy was effective but unpopular. The Roman people wanted revenge, wanted to crush Hannibal, not wait around in frustration. In 216 BC, Rome decided to end the war once and for all. They assembled the largest army in their history to face Hannibal. 86,000 men, double Hannibal's force, commanded by 2 consuls, Paulus and Varro, marched south seeking a decisive battle. On August 2nd, on the plains of Cannae in southern Italy, the 2 armies faced each other under the blazing Mediterranean summer sun. Hannibal had 40,000 infantry and 10,000 cavalry, half the size of Rome's force, but he had a plan that 2,000 years later is still considered genius. He arranged his troops in a crescent formation bulging toward the Romans, with Gauls and Spaniards in the center and his elite Libyan infantry hidden on the flanks. Rome did exactly what Hannibal predicted. They concentrated their attack on the center, believing their numbers would punch through the Carthaginian lines as always. The Carthaginian center fell back slowly, deliberately, and the Romans surged forward, pushing deep into the middle, thinking they were winning. They didn't know this was exactly what Hannibal wanted, that he was drawing them into a trap from which no one could escape. The Libyan infantry on both flanks pivoted inward, squeezing the Romans from 2 sides, while the Carthaginian cavalry crushed the Roman horsemen and wheeled around to strike from behind. 80,000 Roman soldiers were completely surrounded, packed into an ever-shrinking space, so crowded they couldn't even raise their arms to fight. And then the slaughter began. Carthaginian soldiers stabbed into the dense mass of men from every direction, and Roman soldiers fell in layers like grass being cut. Between 50 and 70,000 men died in a few hours that afternoon. It's estimated that every minute 100 Roman soldiers fell. 80 Roman senators lay dead on the fields of Cannae, nearly 1/3 of the entire Senate, along with Consul Paulus and dozens of commanders. Hannibal lost only about 6,000 to 8,000 men, a 10-to-1 kill ratio. A victory so perfect it almost seems unreal. This was the greatest victory in military history, a battle still taught as a classic in military academies around the world 2,000 years later. After Cannae, many Italian city-states betrayed Rome and sided with Hannibal, including Capua, the second largest city on the Italian peninsula. Rome was just 5 days' march away. The gates were wide open. Cavalry commander Hannibal came to Hannibal with a simple but bold proposal. Hannibal told Hannibal, "In 5 days you could be dining on the capital, the center of Roman power where their gods reside." He wasn't wrong. Rome was in complete panic. Women wailed at temple steps. Men prayed desperately to the gods for salvation from annihilation. But Hannibal refused. He said the army needed rest, he had no siege equipment to breach the walls, and Rome wouldn't fall as easily as an ordinary city. Hannibal replied with the most famous words in ancient military history. "You know how to win a victory, Hannibal, but you don't know how to use one." Was this Hannibal's greatest mistake? Historians have debated it for 2,000 years, and no one has a definitive answer. Perhaps Hannibal was right that his exhausted army couldn't siege the city. But perhaps he had missed the only opportunity to end the war. What Hannibal didn't anticipate was that Rome would never surrender. No matter how many battles they lost, no matter how many men they lost, they would keep fighting. The Senate refused to ransom prisoners, banned citizens from mourning, and recruited slaves and criminals into the army, unprecedented in Roman history. They appointed new generals, trained new armies, and adopted Fabian tactics: avoid direct confrontation, cut supply lines, wear Hannibal down day by day. And most infuriatingly, Carthage, Hannibal's homeland, sent almost no significant reinforcements during the 15 years he fought on Italian soil. Political factions in Carthage were jealous of the Barca family. They feared that if Hannibal won, he would become too powerful, so they deliberately left him to fend for himself. For the next 13 years, Hannibal remained in Italy, still winning smaller battles, but unable to end the war because he lacked the troops to siege major cities. He won every battle but was losing the war, a paradox that military strategists would later call the classic lesson of tactics versus strategy. Meanwhile, in Rome, a young man was quietly studying every battle Hannibal had ever fought, learning from his enemy so that one day he could defeat him. That young man was Scipio, the one who had saved his father at the Ticinus, the one who had survived the disaster at Cannae, and now he was ready for revenge. Scipio understood something crucial from Hannibal. Don't attack your enemy where they're strongest, strike where they're weakest, strike at their heart. Instead of facing Hannibal in Italy, where he had been winning for 15 years, Scipio proposed a bold plan: invade North Africa and attack Carthage directly. The Senate agreed, and in 204 BC, Scipio landed on the coast of Tunisia with 30,000 troops, directly threatening Carthage. Carthage panicked. They sent an urgent letter recalling Hannibal. After 15 years of fighting on Italian soil, he was forced to abandon the war he had never lost. Hannibal boarded a ship home with a heart full of bitterness. He had done everything he could, but Carthage hadn't supported him, and now they needed him to save them. He assembled 40,000 new troops in North Africa. But these weren't the battle-hardened veterans he once had in Italy. On October 19th, 202 BC, the two armies faced each other at Zama, about 100 kilometers southwest of Carthage. Hannibal had 80 war elephants, but they were poorly trained, and this would prove disastrous when the battle began. For the first time in his life, Hannibal fought without cavalry superiority, because King Massinissa of Numidia had betrayed Carthage and brought his horsemen to Rome's side. Scipio used the very tactics he had learned from Hannibal, ordering the Roman lines to open gaps for the elephants to pass through rather than trying to stop them head-on. When Roman trumpets blared, the terrified elephants turned and stampeded back into the Carthaginian lines, trampling their own comrades in chaos. The Numidian cavalry, once Hannibal's allies, now crushed the Carthaginian horsemen and wheeled around to strike the infantry from behind, exactly like the tactics at Cannae. 20,000 Carthaginian soldiers died, 20,000 were captured. Hannibal escaped with a small group, but the war ended in complete defeat. Carthage was forced to accept harsh peace terms, pay 10,000 talents of silver over 50 years, surrender their fleet, and never declare war without Rome's permission. Hannibal tried to rebuild Carthage in the following years, and he succeeded. The economy recovered so quickly that Rome grew alarmed. Rome demanded that Carthage hand over Hannibal, and he was forced to flee, living in exile in eastern kingdoms as a wanderer without a country. For the next 20 years, Hannibal helped other kingdoms fight against Rome, but he had no army, no power, only an unfulfilled oath. In 183 BC, Hannibal was 64 years old. Rome finally discovered his hiding place and demanded his extradition. Rather than let Rome capture him, Hannibal drank poison. According to legend, his final words were, "Let us free the Romans from their long anxiety, since they find it tedious to wait for an old man's death." That same year, Scipio Africanus, the man who defeated Hannibal at Zama, also died, rejected by his fellow Romans who resented his success. Two of history's greatest enemies, two military geniuses of their age, both betrayed by their own countries, both dying in the same year. But the story wasn't over. 56 years later, Rome would return to Carthage once more, and this time they would show no mercy. In 149 BC, Rome found a pretext to declare war on Carthage for the third time, even though Carthage was now just a shadow of its former self. The elderly senator Cato ended every speech in the Senate with the same words: "Carthage must be destroyed." And finally, Rome did exactly that. They besieged the city for 3 years. The Carthaginians resisted to the end. Women cut their hair to make ropes for catapults when no other materials remained. In 146 BC, the walls were breached. Roman soldiers poured in, and for 6 days they slaughtered everything that moved in the 700-year-old city. 50,000 survivors were sold into slavery. The city was burned completely. Rome forbade anyone from settling on that land for a century. The Roman commander was Scipio Aemilianus, the adopted grandson of Scipio Africanus, who had defeated Hannibal. He watched the city burn and suddenly burst into tears. He wasn't crying out of pity for Carthage. According to the historian Polybius, who stood beside him, he was crying because he was thinking of the day when Rome would meet the same fate. Hannibal won every major battle but lost the war because tactical genius cannot compensate for strategic and resource deficiencies. Both he and Scipio, enemy and hero, were abandoned by their own countries after devoting their entire lives, a bitter lesson about human gratitude. 2,000 years later, Hannibal's story is still told, not because he won, but because he dared to challenge fate and nearly changed the course of human history.